Welcome to the second part of my conversation with Stephanie Bird on Tsitsi Dangarembga's This Mournable Body. In this part, we discuss the novel's unusual form of address and also connections with Stephanie's previous work on perpetration and complicity. Welcome back to my discussion with Stephanie Bird about Tsitsi Dangarembga's This Mournable Body. If you didn't catch part one, I do suggest checking that out first. So we talked a lot earlier about, the historical context that the novel and indeed the trilogy are addressing. Let's get into a little bit of the detail about the form of the novel. So it follows Tambu almost exclusively. In that sense, it reads almost like a first-person account. But the narration refers to her as you. So can you say a bit about this characteristic of the novel? What effect do you think it has?
Yeah, this is again really quite an extraordinary achievement, I think, because the mode of address throughout the book is largely you. There are obviously other pronouns when other people are being referred to, and sometimes Tambu refers to herself. I think there are a couple of passages where she refers to herself thinking back as I, but it's largely you, and it's in the present tense. And I think that combination, past tense, we might easily think it's Tambu writing now about her past self, but we're actually locked into this uncertain consciousness in the present in which things are happening, which also doesn't raise in any conventional way a scope for an older, more mature Tambu to be able to reflect on her younger self. It really keeps us locked into her present consciousness. I think the you does a number of things, and the first thing I think that is really important is that it points towards an interior split in Tambu, because we have the narrator always saying you. We don't know who the narrator is. The narrator is never specified. We don't know who is saying you. We assume that the you is Tambu. So we have an ambivalence at the centre of an external, somebody must be saying the you and saying it to Tambu, speaking to herself. It is that, and it is something else. But the idea of the interior voices is what I want to talk about first. And I think it picks up on long traditions of interior splits that map onto the battle between emotion and reason. So there are points where Tambu is thinking slightly more reflectively on what she's been doing and her emotions. So you've got the desire to do something and the reason trying to stop her. And perhaps the most disturbing example of this is when she lifts a stone to participate in the stoning of her hostel mate, Gertrude. If I could just meet here. The sight of your beautiful hostel mate fills you with an emptiness that hurts. You do not shrink back as one mind in your head wishes. Instead, you obey the other, push forward. You reach for a stone, it is in your hand. Your arm rises in slow motion. So here we have a moment where there is this internal battle between wanting to participate in violence and the other voice that is trying to stop it happening, which is also a split between desire and morality, which are very conventional tropes of internal split. I think it's also a manifestation of profound self-alienation, the alienation between the person she is and would like to be and the person she has become. And this relates precisely then to her sense of self that has been undermined by the interacting factors of race and gender, and it further complicated by the tension between tradition and community and modernity rather. So education, her elite Western education, has put her at odds with the patriarchal expectation of her rural homestead, which value women, these expectations value women in as far as women conform to patriarchal values and remain in a position of subordination to men. This is how Dangarembga describes it in a book of essays. So Tambu moves away from the traditional values of family life and community, in which women do not become educated, and strives for a better life with its material award. So her ambition depends on financial success, and in an increasingly competitive neoliberal capitalist system that places little value on providing for one's family and community. But at the same time, as I've already said, the colonial education can't be fulfilled. The promise of that can't be fulfilled because she's black. An individual meritocracy isn't rewarded if she's black. And so she has this intersecting internal split between education and self-fulfillment, because she loves education, she loves reading, she thrives. Between that and the sort of self-realization, but that takes her away from her community, and the split between having an education that devalues her blackness and yet wanting self-fulfillment, but a self-fulfillment that constantly points out that she's not white. But also then the issue of wanting to be have different opportunities as a woman, but there is no idealization here of what it would have meant if she'd stayed on the homestead because her mother is uneducated. So these internal alienations that are structurally given in the way in the clash between tradition and modernity, both of which involve a position that she can't inhabit. So that is what I wanted to say about the you and the two voices in her head, as it were. The you reflecting that. I think the you goes a step further. I think the you does more than that, because it also replicates a split between the self and the other. Because we've got this external voice always addressing the you, the you embodies the impossibility of separating the individual, the I, could, as you say, be written in the first person, but the you insists upon the impossibility of the separation of the individual from the collective. So the individual is actually conceived of through this mode of direct address, and that address is both an external and an internalized voice. You can't separate I from you. The you is prior here. And that, I think, suggests that the self cannot thrive separately or can't be understood separately from a social collective. So she can't become the individual demanded by racial capitalism. She can't escape the communal bonds of family and homestead. So however much she tries to leave behind the bag of mealies that her mother is giving her, and they keep popping up rather comically in different places throughout the book, it follows her and reminds her of the neglected social relations and responsibilities that come through being someone who cannot be separated from community. And her potential redemption at the end of the novel actually then depends on the acceptance of Unhu or Ubuntu, which is an African concept that precisely defines humanness in relation to others. The I can't be conceived of as a separate entity. So there are various translations, and depend on other scholars for these translations. These include quote, to affirm one's humanity by recognizing the humanity in others and on that basis establish humane relations with them. That's one translation. Or, quote, others, or another, the individual's existence is relative to that of the group. So Unhu represents an ethics based in collectivism and is an irreducible mutual responsibility. And I think the you form of address reinforces that constantly throughout. And at the end, Tambu actually seems to be allowing herself to become part of a collective of women who reject traditional patriarchal structures that oppress women, who refuse to seek an alternative to that tradition in neoliberal competitive individualism, represented by Tracy, and which Tambu has, of course, been pursuing as an alternative, but actually, nevertheless, see themselves as part of a wider collective. So Nyasha, her cousin, persists with an unprofitable business, which is workshops for young women, trying to give them a sense of self-worth, importance, and it's very political for her to be doing this. And then her Aunt Lucia's security company is thriving and is imbued with the values of Unhu. So I think the you insists on us having to think about the I, not as a separate thing, but only as constructed through a collective. It's worth saying that, because I've a couple of times mentioned the potential redemption at the end, I don't think we have an idealized end, or perhaps we do. It's left open what will happen. But as another scholar has pointed out, the fact that the sort of entrepreneurial company within which Tambu works is a security company run by Lucy, who is an ex-combatant in the Wars of Independence. Actually, there's an irony there, because a security company is profiting on the ongoing and possibly increasing violence endemic in the Zimbabwean society. So it's an ironic ending. There's hope, but it's also ironized. It's not, and again, this comes back to the challenge of the novel, which is that we're not given easy answers and we're not given an easy ending, but we're not left hopeless either.
Yeah. And I mean, on that issue of sort of, do we get resolution? One thing we haven't sort of addressed directly is the fact that Tambu clearly seems to be traumatized, and there are several passages that use, or I mean, we've mentioned the violence, but there are several passages that use images of insects, particularly ants, to describe, I suppose, a combination of a physiological and psychological state, right? So, I mean, what do you have to say about that representation of trauma, and how does it tie into some of the things we've discussed?
I think the emphasis on the physical response to trauma and the trying to look away from it, I think is very powerful, because it's something that it's described as though it is happening. So that profound physiological response that people have to trauma is very well conveyed and represented, and also in a way that is actually beyond Tambu's control. So the sort of return of the repressed, to use the Freudian shorthand, that the repressed manifests itself through the body. And in terms of ants, because and insects, because they are, it's the sensation of prickling on the skin as well. And perhaps they don't debilitate her, but they nevertheless are signs of a profound discomfort. And I think, so that's one thing. I think the other thing is that these moments of the insects and the ants, they're not just related to the repressed violence. There's one very interesting moment where she is reflecting on her cousin poor European, with who starts to develop quite some empathy, because her incomprehension of her cousin and how her cousin's has made her choices in life and benefited from education, but not really making use of what she could with that education. These are decisions that, because they are not clear, because she actually talks about the liminality of this situation, and it's that discomfort with not having an either you're rich and you benefit from your education, or you're poor, or you're white and rich and you're black and poor. Any decisions that don't fit into her quite rigid expectation of how status is achieved make her incredibly uncomfortable. So it's not limited to trauma in the sense of PTSD in the response to violence. It's also a very physical experience of discomfort when she is challenged to think beyond her very clear categories. And when she's confronted that, I suppose when she's confronted that through her cousin and her lifestyle choices. What else would I want to say about that? Moving more into other ways in which trauma is represented. I think one aspect of the novel which continues to hold my interest is the way in which trauma is represented. So all these devastating experiences, both physical, structural racism, pervasive violence against women, that Tambu has experienced and continues to experience, there is nevertheless a very strong comic element to the text. So we have a text in which very disturbing things are touched on, really profound issues of social and individual violence, and yet, with a protagonist who isn't particularly likable. Certainly for many readers, likable isn't perhaps the word one could use, even if we empathize with her. There are many points where she's but nevertheless, there is a strong comic element that runs through the text. So often, anguish, discomfort, revulsion are combined with comedy. And I think that's quite interesting, because it doesn't belittle Tambu. It doesn't belittle her suffering. She's never turned into a satirical object of criticism, because it arises out of this you address. So she's never objectified. The comedy actually arises out of a perspective that is fairly interior, and yet we are able to see the clash of different perspectives that generates comedy. There's a very funny passage where she's got a house with a pool, and she's driving back to her homestead to visit after far too long years of not having been back, and she completely inhabits the hierarchy of what you can do if you've got a new car, compared to all those people who have second, third and fourth hand cars, people scattering out of the way as she drives, oblivious, just showing off. And it just is, we're both appalled at her views, but yet it's very funny. So there's satire combined, but she's never objectified, and I think this is it's a delicate combination that I think Dangarembga has pulled off very well. So trauma is also of trauma, which is very.
Thank you. I didn't mention any of the comic aspects or the comedy in the questions, but I think thanks for pulling those parts out, because you're right, there are sections of the novel that are funny, but it's never comfortable because it's combined with, either behavior that's kind of appalling or the context that we've discussed. Just to finish off then, let's sort of zoom out a little bit. I mean, you've worked extensively on perpetration and complicity, and like largely with respect to German literature and the Holocaust. So how would you put some of that work next to or in conjunction with what you said about Dangarembga?
Yeah, I think what is fascinating about Dangarembga's This Mournable Body, and what has also fascinated me with certain responses to Holocaust atrocities, the atrocities of the Holocaust, that explore complicity, is, as Dangarembga puts it, that complicity creeps up on you. And I gave the longer quote from Dangarembga in an interview, but that idea that complicity comes in stages. At each stage, there may be a good reason to behave in a certain way. And there are some excellent books in which, and I include this one among them, that really show that creep and show how the creep depends on a complex interaction of personal and social motivation. The two are inseparable, because as discourses shift in society, so too individuals can alter or find space for motivations that actually emerge as a meaning that they are complicit in harms. I think another thing that that many of the texts I've worked on point to, and again, this is why this novel is also it excels at that, is how they explore and expose what I'd say narratives of the good self. That there are ways in which individuals justify their behavior to themselves or actually deceive themselves, and we see this repeatedly with Tambu. How the types of strategies that she resorts to, obviously they're simply not acknowledging or avoiding, but there are also ideas that she is deceiving herself that what she is doing is the best way to get to where she wants to be, or is the right thing. But also strategies of avoidance. I mean, Tambu repeatedly has moments of insight. You read the novel for the first time and you think, wow, when she comes out of the psychiatric hospital, she's wept, almost can't stop weeping for the first time. You think, this is the turning point in the novel. And we're quickly disillusioned because she falls back into the same sort of comfort zone of ambition, and so I think that I think literature is a sort of is an example par excellence of how we can see those strategies working, and we're caught up with, and then have to recognize those levels of deceit that can happen. I think. Talking more generally, but I'm talking about what I've been interested in. Holocaust is really interested in complicity, or the complicity of perpetrators, but also the complicity of normal. Tambu, she's of course not normal in that she's so phenomenally gifted and intelligent and passed the exam to get into this elite school. But normal in the sense that she is also representative or typical Zimbabwean in other ways. But the literature of these texts, they are often in forms that challenge the reader to think about her own complicity or strategy of reinforcing a sense of self or the notion of a good self. And this is again why the you is interesting, because the you inevitably addresses the reader. And there are other literary strategies in novels that can draw the reader into really thinking, okay, what does it mean to draw? How is it that we can deceive ourselves so effectively? Or what is it we do to make excuses for ourselves? And then finally, I'd like to come back to the point about comedy. I've worked a fair amount on texts that do what Dangarembga does here, which is to use comedy in a very serious way. I mean, when I talk about texts having a comic aesthetic, it can, of course, introduce a note of levity into a text, make it lighter, give moments of comic relief. But actually, comedy, with all its different forms, including irony, including just giving different perspectives that jostle up against each other in a way that can be incongruous and therefore funny. These are actually often very interesting challenges to how we conceptualize trauma, how we think about victim responses to trauma, what it means to inhabit the position of victimhood, or to reflect on that position and what can be done with that. So it's using a comic aesthetic to explore horror trauma, and that is fascinating. So that's how she fits into other work that I've done.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. I think really useful way to round off, just to sort of contextualize it. I suppose, yeah, in terms of your other work on comedy and the comic as, you know, a serious, I suppose, a serious mode of provoking thought that sort of almost breaks.
Thank you. That's very nicely put, Ivan.
Breaks those genres and the expectations we have of them. Yeah. And thank you for such detailed answers on what you described as a challenging text. And I thoroughly agree. And what you said has caused me to think a lot more about this Mournable Body. So thank you so much. We will leave our main discussion.
Well, thanks for really interesting questions.
You're welcome. Yeah. And we'll come back for part 3 when we'll hear your recommendations for further reading.